What's up, folks? How's it going? This is Waj. Hope you guys are all doing well. And what you're looking at is a camera comparison difference between the iPhone XR and the Pixel 3. So here, the front-facing side, we're going to basically take a look at the rear-facing camera. Now, the Pixel 3 is very famous for having an awesome rear-facing camera, but let's see how the iPhone XR stacks, because it's very similar to the iPhone XS models in terms of most things. It just doesn't have the telephoto lens. So we're going to be taking a look at a couple of different scenarios in terms of outdoor, indoor conditions, good light, bad light. So that way you have a good idea in terms of how these two compare in terms of all the different situations. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so I'm now back from a full day of shooting, and typically with our camera comparisons, we just roll the footage and a couple of stills side by side with some music, and I'll let you guys decide what looks better to you. I'm going to do something a little bit different over here because I think this is way too interesting just to put some video and some music onto. I want to show you guys side by side with my interpretation and my experience of what I think looks actually better, and that way you guys have a better idea in terms of where I'm coming from and which camera is ultimately the best one, because this is probably one of the most important things about a smartphone, and I think it's important to cover all the bases. So we're going to be taking a look at the overall sharpness factor, on which delivers the most clarity. We're going to be taking a look at color rendition, dynamic range, also aspects of the video stabilization, and then we'll come back for another reflection. So let's get right into it. Now, firstly, we're going to evaluate the overall color rendition of both cameras. What I found what the iPhone tends to do is add a little bit of contrast and saturation. You can see that in this image with the miniature sailing ship. Notice that the blue color in the hull appears to be a little bit more saturated and vibrant compared to the Pixel 3 on the right hand side. In reality, the blue isn't as saturated and as vibrant as the iPhone portrays it. In fact, it looks a lot more closer to what the Pixel 3 represents. Another tendency of the iPhone is to slightly overexpose the image just to make it look a little bit more brighter, and again to make it pop more, which is fine for Instagram and everything, but if you want to portray reality in the most realistic way possible, sometimes you have to cut down on all that post-processing. Now, I'm pretty impressed with the metering system on the Pixels. Not only does it render color a little bit more realistically than the iPhone, but it also has active tracking capabilities where it tracks a single point in a scene and maintains constant exposure and focus on that point, even if you're moving the phone around all over the place. Now, in terms of the dynamic range of both cameras, if you take a look at this example with the watchtower, on the upper part of the image, you're going to see that the clouds on the iPhone XR are actually retaining a lot of information. There's a lot of texture information versus the Pixel 3 kind of blows that information into white, and we're losing all that texture in the clouds in the skies. Now, on the ground by the bushes, you can see that the Pixel is also crushing the blacks and losing significant amount of shadow details, where the iPhone managed to preserve a lot of the details in the branches, leaves, and even the pattern on the fence could be clearly seen on the iPhone versus all that information is lost on the Pixel 3. Now, the same result goes for shooting video in HDR mode. You're going to see a lot more details in the shadows and highlights on the iPhone. Same thing with the amount of depth in the color information. Now, this might not be the most realistic interpretation of the scene, but that's really not what HDR is about. It's about capturing the most information as possible in the colors, the highlights, the shadows, and everything, and this is where the iPhone is really shining at. Now, I understand you can shoot RAW on the Pixel 3, and that way you can take it into Lightroom and Photoshop and really get more out of your Pixel 3 images compared to the compressed JPEG formats, but straight out of the box, in terms of dynamic range, I think the iPhone is the winner over here. Now, let's talk about sharpness and clarity. In terms of video, I think both present the same level of sharpness and clarity. I don't think that there's a major difference between the two, but it's a different story when it comes to stills. Take a look at this shot of the Blade Runner spinner model. You can clearly see some fine details in the paint blemishes, and even notice the edges of the decal labeled Police 995. You can see that it's clearly defined on the Pixel versus it's not as defined on the iPhone. The iPhone is still very sharp, but if you take a look at this canvas painting picture over here, and if we zoom in a little bit more, you're going to see that again we're seeing more fine details in the canvas material itself on the Pixel 3 compared to the iPhone XR. It is a subtle difference, but a difference nonetheless. Lastly, here's my favorite example. Notice that there's a lot more detail on the leaf on the Pixel, with more information, not only in terms of the individual kind of ridges of the leaf, but even in the color spectrum. The colors are more deeper, richer green, and keep in mind, this is exactly how the leaf actually looked like. The Pixel doesn't really exaggerate the colors or boost the saturation or contrast too much. And although the iPhone again looks pretty sharp, it just looks a little bit more bloomy and slightly again overexposed to what the actual image looked like in real life. Moreover, in terms of video stabilization, here you can see that both are relatively smooth. Again, I'm just walking with the cameras, but on the Pixel 3, the motion looks a little bit more natural and less jerky than the iPhone XR. Now, at times, the iPhone stabilization system has this kind of rolling shutter slash jello-vision effect, especially with kind of jerky motions. And there's actually many potential reasons of why that happens. One could be the whole downsampling effect, where you're taking a large 12 megapixel image and downsampling it to 8 megapixel for your 4K video. And during that downsampling process, if there's any fast motion or any complex image processing going on, such as with electronic image stabilization, there could be some artifacts as a result of that. Now, with the Pixel 3, it's actually using the same size sensor, 12 megapixel, but when shooting video, you're going to notice that the image is a little bit more zoomed or cropped in compared to what you see on the iPhone. And there's actually two reasons for that. One, it does have a longer lens, 28mm versus 26mm, but more importantly, when shooting video, the Pixel 3 actually uses a tighter crop of that 12 megapixel sensor, and that means it's more efficient in the whole downsampling process to shoot video, and more resources and allocations could be put into stabilizing that image, and that's why you have that smoother overall image. There's probably a number of other factors, but that's definitely one that contributes to the better image stabilization and indeed optical stabilization system that we have on the Pixel 3. Now, the last thing that we're going to take a look at is an extreme low light test. We're going to start with kind of a moderate low light test. Here we have a picture of the Millennium Falcon, basically in relatively normal conditions. This is an indoor ambient environment. There's a window with the blinds half shut, about 2 to 3 feet away from the Falcon itself, and you can see that we have a relatively clear image on both smartphones. The Pixel 3 obviously is the sharper camera, so we're seeing a little bit more detail there, but not a major difference. It's a different situation if we move the Falcon into a very poorly lit condition. We now have the blinds fully closed, there's very little ambient light, and in this extreme situation you can find that the iPhone is actually shining over here. Now granted, there's a hell of a lot of post-processing going on over here with noise reduction, boosting the contrast, preserving the details that were in the image to begin with, but compared to the Pixel 3, which is an absolute mess with noise all over the place, there's details being lost in the shadows, the highlights, everything. There's some color distortion going on with some weird red tinting effect, and sure, you can argue that the iPhone looks kind of fake and super processed, but we're still getting a lot of detail that's preserved that the Pixel 3 completely lost, and the iPhone is certainly generating the more usable image. Now, lastly, when it comes to slow motion, I think both are very, very similar. You're looking at 240 frames per second at 1080p on both platforms. I shot some slow motion earlier, and as you can see, they both look fairly good. Autofocusing is always a little bit tricky, but for most of your action sequences, I think you're going to find pretty decent results on both platforms. So no real major differences or complaints there. Now, to sum up everything we've talked about in this video, if we were to take a look at the strengths of the iPhone, I think in terms of dynamic range, it's definitely the superior device, and in terms of extreme lighting situations where we have very, very minimal light, I think the post-processing system is a little bit more superior and gives you a little bit more usable imagery when it comes to shooting in extreme low light situations. In most cases, you're going to be using the flash when it comes to that circumstance, but it's kind of interesting interesting to note that this is actually the better extreme low light camera straight out of the box. Now, obviously, this is the more capable camera. It's the more realistic camera. The Pixel 3 offers exceptional video and photo quality that I think is definitely best in class when it comes to most situations that you're going to be shooting into. And I can see why there's so many people praising it, but it's definitely not a perfect camera, and there are situations where the iPhone is better. Now, one just last thing I want to mention is that we're going to have an ultimate battery life comparison between the XS, XS Max, the XR, the Pixel 3 XL, as well as the Samsung Note 9 and S9 smartphones. So if you're interested in seeing which one has the ultimate battery performance, lasts the longest, you're definitely going to want to tune into that video. So check out the description, or make sure you're subscribed for that latest update. Other than that, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you real soon. Take care.